Welcome back to KIRO Nights. This is always a fun conversation for me. One, because it matters so much locally, and two, because it's nice to talk to somebody who really knows what they are talking about. Of course, I'm inviting Jon Ostrower, the editor-in-chief and founder of the Air Current, which is they cover aerospace industry, but I mean it's really an aviation-focused publication, primarily a lot of it on Boeing because that's where it's based. Jon, thank you for joining KIRO Nights.
Always great to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
So you had a story that prompted me to get on the phone immediately and start bugging you, and that was about this big decision right in front of Southwest Airlines and 300 airplanes. And Southwest has been a big Boeing customer, but it's not a done deal that Southwest is going to be making those 300 airplanes 737 MAXs. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, they are the biggest Boeing customer, actually.
Okay.
In the history of the company, they have right now they have over 700 737s in their fleet, and
wow.
They want more, and they built their business on the 737. Right. Just to set the context for this a little bit, Southwest was one of the big drivers for why the MAX became the MAX. Why Boeing decided to re-engine the 737 rather than go do an all-new airplane. And so Southwest has been a tremendously important customer for years and years because of the continuity that they have needed to run their business. And so now, coming off of the MAX grounding, which actually Southwest will be back in service with the MAX on March 11th. They'll be the third U.S. airline to do so. American was first, followed by United, and then Southwest coming up in March. But now they also have a ton, and when I say a ton, I mean they have 470 something 737-700s. So every single one built in Renton, delivered from Boeing Field to Southwest. That's one variant of 737 that they have in their fleet that is bigger than most airline fleets in the world. And those are aging airplanes. Those first started delivering to Southwest. They were the launch operator back in late 1997. They started flying in early 1998. And so these airplanes have been delivering continuously until about 2012 or 2013. But they're getting old, and they need to be the older ones need to be replaced. They're pushing 25 years here. So Southwest literally needs to replace every single one of those airplanes. So that's a deal that they're looking at right now for at least 300. And their first choice is to go with Boeing and GE through the CFM joint venture, which makes the engines for those airplanes. But obviously the relationship has been strained over the years with the MAX grounding, with a few other incidents before that have been really costly, and so it's all is not well in paradise. So now what we have is the report that I had in the Air Current last week was essentially saying that these 300 airplanes really are ultimately Boeing and GE's to lose, and it comes down to a few contractual sticking points here. But again, this incredibly tight relationship that has defined the most successful business model in aviation is really strained right now. And so this could go either way. And if they can't get past these early discussions about these 300 airplanes, it looks like Southwest is seriously considering opening up a head-to-head competition between the MAX 7, which is the smaller version that would replace the 700 fleet, and also the Airbus A220, formerly the Bombardier AC series. These are all airplanes that are under 150 seats. And Boeing has really focused its attention above 150 seats. So this is really, if it goes to this point, gets to a head-to-head competition, the Southwest senior executive that we spoke to for the story, among others, said that there's a strong chance that Boeing could lose the overall competition if it does go head-to-head. So, there's an enormous amount at stake here.
We're speaking with Jon Ostrower, the editor-in-chief of the Air Current, an aviation industry newsletter. So Jon, then let's break it down then. What are the advantages of going? I mean, obviously, some of the language I'm assuming here is negotiating positional language, right? You want to put it out there that this is not a done deal because you want to get the best possible deal for your company. But what are the advantages of Southwest essentially changing its fleet over, or at least a big portion of its fleet over, to an Airbus model as opposed to a 737 MAX?
Well, I think you raise a really, really good point, which is that in most cases we see airlines negotiating in public, trying to get the best deal from their supplier, in this case Boeing or Airbus or whomever they're trying to buy airplanes from at any given moment. Southwest doesn't usually operate that way. They don't operate it in the public sphere to apply pressure to their suppliers. It's just not how they operate. So to be at this point, I think underscores sort of the seriousness of where things are in this long-term 50-year partnership between Boeing and Southwest. So it is absolutely unusual behavior for them to be communicating like this, and I think that that's important kind of context for all this. That this is not a low-cost carrier trying to squeeze every little penny out of a contract like a Ryanair or an EasyJet or whomever. This is very different. So, but to get to the core of your question about the A220, which by the way would be the first time Southwest will have operated in Southwest colors, an aircraft, a non-737 with any kind of numbers that they weren't immediately planning on getting rid of. And so it would effectively break the continuity of one of their core ideals, which is that every pilot, generally speaking, a few very small technical exceptions, but every pilot can fly every airplane. And you don't have to worry that the pilot showing up at the gate can't fly the airplane because it's not an airplane that they're trained to fly. So it's a lot of simplicity based inherently around Southwest operations. So this would, if they went with an Airbus, it would be breaking that. So sticking with the 737 MAX 7, which, by the way, Southwest is fully aware that is an older, less efficient version of the size of the airplane that they want compared to the A220, which first entered service in 2016 and has effectively the same generation of engines, but it is a newer technology airplane, significantly newer. So again, there's a cost to Southwest to breaking this continuity by essentially adding complexity to their operation by having different pilot pools and having to think about what airplane goes where and which pilots are in position to fly it. And all of a sudden, you need two different types of equipment at the gate. I mean, this is an airline that so knows the 737 better than anyone else in the world, better than Boeing in a lot of cases.
This is really interesting. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I mean, the complexity here is the complexity of the simplicity, right?
Right.
that Southwest has created in their operations is amazing. So, you start thinking about all these different factors, and some of these are very, very granular. Like, okay, the bins are going to be different on an A220 versus 737. And can you load the airplane as fast? And so the A220 has 3 seats on one side of the aisle and 2 on the other. And the bins are one size for the 3 side and a smaller size for the 2 side. And does that mess up your operation? And that's like the really granular stuff that you just go through in terms of figuring out if this can fit in your operation. And so, on the 737 side, they know the airplane. They know the bins. They know how it can turn. So there's like an inherent cost savings there to fit in your existing operation. So whatever Southwest ends up deciding, it's going to have to be a balance of all of these different factors. But right now, where we're at is Boeing, GE, and Southwest in a room trying to figure this thing out.
Well, this is really, we're speaking with Jon Ostrower, the editor-in-chief of the Air Current, an aviation newsletter, but it focuses a lot on Boeing because it's based here in Seattle or here in this area. John, so this is a super interesting point that you raised. Essentially what you're saying, and if I can sort of distill what you're saying, if I distill it incorrectly, just let me know. But it sounds like Southwest's enormous leverage with Boeing is that they are the biggest purchaser in company history. But their amazing liability, their reduction in leverage, is that they are the biggest purchaser in Boeing. In other words, Boeing also is fully aware of how difficult it would be for Southwest to use any other plane because it would involve this enormous lift of retraining pilots and changing virtually everything in their operation to accommodate a plane that kind of does the same thing, exactly does the same thing as a 737 MAX. So So how does this then? What are they looking for? My understanding, talking to some other people in the airline industry, is there's a lot of leverage going on behind the scenes for Boeing to compensate in some manner all of these existing and outstanding 737 MAX orders because of a reticence about people. Like, I know American Airlines people have talked about it. United has talked about this reticence about flying on this aircraft that is still not, from a public safety standpoint, from a public perception standpoint, not considered, an airplane without some sort of like worry to it, even though I think from a technical standpoint, there shouldn't be anything at all to worry about this aircraft. Is Southwest looking just to get maybe a better deal on these aircraft? Because there's no company more closely associated with 737s, of course, than Southwest.
Well, certainly Boeing's biggest advantage here is being the incumbent. Once you're already there, you can have a very different conversation. Airbus is sort of, at this point, on the outside looking in. They haven't started the campaign yet. So, but to your point, I think the one thing that we've seen from Southwest is how all in they are on the MAX. And, the confidence of the flying public certainly is a part of this. But I think that Southwest is fully committed to taking delivery of the more than 200 MAXes they already have on order. Remember, with 300 we're talking about would be 300 in addition to the 200. These numbers are enormous. So, and then you start tracking it out to once the industry returns to growth, which there's expectation that it will, Southwest will get to a fleet of 1,000, and you're going to have 500. You're going to have 500 or 600 or 700 of these out there. So, you see the commercial potential here for either Boeing or Airbus. But, I think one of the things that what it comes down to is that, yes, there has been a very strained relationship between Boeing and Southwest. And I think one of the things that Boeing with Southwest has gone through, and I'm aware of that part of this whole review about this airplane or that airplane on an operational basis, but also on a strategic basis, where Southwest has asked themselves, is having a single airplane and a single supplier of that airplane the right thing for your business?
Right.
And partially what they've come up with, one of the answers is, well, if you have 100% exposure to one airplane or one manufacturer, if that airplane is grounded, you're screwed. But at the same time, if you have 50% of your fleet, when you're talking about 700 or 800, 900, 1,000 airplanes, if one of those goes down for any reason and you're grounded, you're still screwed.
Yeah.
The problem is in aviation, there is, the risk is still huge. You're still ending up, in bankruptcy and potentially if you lose half of a fleet that large.
So
in terms of operation. So, it's really tough in terms of the diversity to make the case one way or another. I think there are really strong pros and cons, but I think it's going to really come down to the relationships that Southwest has built. And really, this is the ultimate test of that relationship, and whether or not Boeing and GE together can, get this over the line and continue this partnership.
So this is going to sound like maybe this is an artful thought experiment, but maybe not grounded on reality. But I'm going to let you call me out on that. Is there a possibility then that Boeing, given the size of Southwest, essentially it's Boeing Airlines, given that, could the pandemic have actually inadvertently saved this relationship rather than hurt it? In other words, these planes were grounded at the time when no one was flying. And did that actually put the brakes on Southwest looking elsewhere because it really wasn't flying many aircraft anyway?
Well, what we know for sure, and it is a bit of a thought exercise, but I appreciate the opportunity to sort of dive into the hypothetical. But I think what we saw at the end of 2019, before the pandemic began, was Southwest saying, well, next year we really need to answer the question about, is it still right to have a single aircraft type? Is it still right to have a single aircraft manufacturer supplying us that? Is that the right model for our operations? He said, we're going to figure that out next year. Well, next year arrived, and the entire bottom fell out of the industry. And so the airplane was grounded, and airplanes were not being delivered. And Southwest was not having to take new airplanes into their fleet at a time when they certainly didn't need them, and they certainly absolutely didn't want them. and concurrently, at a time when they were working with Boeing to ultimately figure out a compensation plan for the grounding. So, it certainly has elongated the process of answering this question. I don't know for sure whether or not COVID would have driven that one way or another. I think, largely speaking, this is a question that they were going to have to answer inevitably. And this is actually an even bigger picture that has nothing to do with the pandemic. So, forgive the non sequitur here, but Boeing is also in the process of figuring out what to do with their own new airplane plans.
Right.
And that's an airplane that looks to be about 200 to 240 seats. So Southwest doesn't want an airplane that large. They want to stay between 150 and 175. And so in these categories, what Southwest realizes is that fundamentally they're going to have to move away from the 737 eventually, because they know that the cockpit that is going to go in this new Boeing airplane whenever it's launched and whenever it's ready is going to eventually go into the airplane that replaces the 737. So Southwest is going to have to change its operational model regardless. The question is, do you do it now or do you do it in the early 2030s? And what are the pros and cons to making that decision in 2021 versus 2027, 2028? So, a lot of this conversation is ultimately inevitable. The question is, whose airplane do they end up bringing in between here and there? And they know that they need an airplane the size of the 737-700, and they don't yet need an airplane the size of what would probably be the replacement for the 737 in the 2030s. So a lot of this happens regardless of the backdrop of COVID, though it certainly has slowed things down for sure.
We're speaking with Jon Ostrower, editor-in-chief of the Air Current, talking about Boeing and 737 MAX orders that may or may not be coming from Southwest Airlines. All right, one more question, John. I mean, when you're talking about, and this was really interesting, I didn't realize the scope of the size of Southwest Airlines as a customer of Boeing. Essentially, it is by far the biggest customer of Boeing. Can you contextualize, like, from a 737 MAX standpoint, if Southwest were to buy none of these, what percentage of the whole allotment of 737 MAXs on any given year is Southwest potentially purchasing?
So that's a great question. So if Southwest bought 300 more 737s today, Boeing would increase its overall backlog of orders for the 737 by almost 10%.
Wow.
It's that important. And I think one thing to remember about the context of the relationship between Boeing and Southwest is if you look back in the years after 9/11, Southwest actually was taking almost one out of every 4 Boeing airplanes that they built as Boeing ramped down so significantly with the recession after 9/11 and the dot-com bubble bursting. And so the combination of those two factors, really, overbuilding going into that, but ultimately Southwest was a strategic backstop for Boeing. Right. When other airlines couldn't take delivery, Southwest would. And look, we are living again in times when the economic strain on Boeing is acute, given COVID. And there are a lot of other operational factors which underpin why it is as acute as it is. So having that backstop for Southwest is so much more than just a plane maker and a supplier. It really comes down to whether or not Boeing is going to have the strategic underpinnings to ramp up production of the 737 over the next several years as they rebuild from the grounding and through COVID. And Southwest, as far as I can tell, wants that. The question is whether or not they're actually going to be able to get there.
That is Jon Ostrower, editor-in-chief of the Air Current, and his story on Boeing and its biggest customer, which is Southwest Airlines, and where Southwest is going to go with a sizable jet order that it is preparing to figure out right now. John, I can't thank you enough for coming on KIRO Nights. It was a super interesting conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, John. That was great. That was exactly what I was looking for. It felt like that was, these sort of stories about these orders and real big decision-making happen is the kind of stuff I think that, given how many we've got a lot of Boeing employees in our listener group. So for me, it's always really great to get that sort of context for it. So I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure. That was fantastic.
All right.
Let's do it again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jon.
Okay. See you, Mike.
More to come on KIRO Nights right after the break.